John's ready.
Well, welcome back, everyone. This is Two Beards in a Bible. I'm John Swano.
I'm Dave Tenney.
And we're just getting started here. We're resuming with 1 Corinthians 9 and at verse 19. So,
Yeah.
But you know, you're right. Look, I got the little mark right
there. I'll go ahead and read here. I'm going to read till the end of the chapter. No, I'm not. I lied.
Okay.
I'm going to read to verse 23. 19 to 23. It says, "For though I am free from all men, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win the more. And to the Jews I became as a Jew, that I might win Jews. To those who are under the law as under the law, that I might win those who are under the law. To those who are without law, as without law, not being without law toward God, but under law toward Christ, that I might win those who are without law. To the weak I become as weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all men, that I might by all means save some. Now this I do for the gospel's sake, that I may be a partaker of it with you." We'll go ahead and stop there.
Yeah.
And talk about it. Now this is one of them tongue twisters.
It is. It is. I think the operative statement there is that I have become all things to all men.
Yeah.
That I might by all means save some. I think that kind of sums up
What he
was saying up ahead of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you could take a lots of examples as you think about Paul's life. You think about examples where he did these things.
Mm-hmm.
So I think about when he went to the Gentiles and he would quote from like Gentile writings, or where he would just fit himself into their customs,
right?
Whatever needed to be done. So Acts chapter 17, I have a note I wrote down in verse 23. And this is kind of an example of him going to the Gentiles, where he goes to the Areopagus.
Yeah.
Right. So he says, "Men of Athens, I perceive that in all things you are very religious. For I was passing through, and considering the objects of your worship, I even found an altar with this inscription: to the unknown God. Therefore, the one whom you worship without knowing him, I proclaim you God." I'm trying to think of where there's. He says in verse 28, he says, "For in him we live and move and have our being, as also some of your own poets have said. For we are also his offspring."
Yeah.
So that was a Stoic poet that he quoted there. But it's interesting that Paul was raised this devout Jew, but he knew these writings of some of the Gentile people, and here he makes a play of that,
right,
so to speak.
And then what's the for us today to see that and kind of apply the concept there to us as Christians today, that's valuable, because as we talk to people, as we interact with people that have a different view, a different perhaps religious view, we need to be able to meet them where they're at.
Yeah.
Pick up on the commonality of, maybe they have some belief in the Bible. Maybe there's some things that they connect over to the scriptures, and that we can kind of get into their minds that way.
And Paul did these things without committing any sort of sin or anything like that.
Right. Yeah, he didn't bow down and worship the other gods.
No, not at all.
To do that.
In Galatians chapter 2, Paul talks about this sort of thing again. Galatians 2 and verse 11. He says that when Peter had come to Antioch, he says, "I withstood him to his face, because he was to be blamed for before certain men came from James, he would eat with the Gentiles. But when they came, he withdrew himself and separated himself, fearing those who were of the circumcision. And the rest of the Jews also played the hypocrite with him, so that even Barnabas was carried away with their hypocrisy." So, Paul's calling out Peter here that for a while, he would eat with the Gentiles and hang out with them, but then a certain group of Jews came down and they basically influenced Peter to do the wrong thing, to separate himself. He wasn't being all things to all men. He wasn't serving all men. Peter withdrew himself.
Right. Yeah, and today you might think of some people might say that they have to. I've heard people say that that they should like go into all these places that where sinful things take place and evangelize to them in those places and while there may be some kind of connection that you think of between that idea and here what we're reading. One of I think the difference is that, as you pointed out, Paul didn't put himself in the position of carrying on with them in the disorder.
He never committed sin by doing these things.
So we can't go and go to a place and sin along with people just to get their trust to try to share the gospel with them. And I think some people maybe I've heard of situations where people take that too far and they that's in effect what they do, and they put themselves into the fire.
In fact, we're going to talk about this in a few episodes. In chapter 10, he kind of talks about some of those ideas, about eating things that were sacrificed to idols,
right, for conscience sake.
Yeah. So, anyways, we'll probably hit on that again here pretty soon.
Yeah.
The other thing Paul did, and we see him do this all the time, is when he went to when he was around Jewish people, Paul appealed to his own Jewishness,
right?
And remember when Paul kept a vow, he wasn't under obligation to do that sort of thing,
right?
But it wasn't the thing that he did was not sinful,
right?
And
yeah, and when Paul having that background with the Jews allowed him an understanding of the mindset, the ability to, I'm going to say commiserate, but to empathize with them and where they're at. I often think of, for a worldly example, and I'm sure this probably applies, in everybody's family to some degree, but my father's side of the family is Serbian, and my dad he's a certain way. And in order to talk to him, you have to understand, and sometimes, it's an intense conversation and it may even sound like he's yelling, but he's not yelling. It's just the way that it is.
Yes.
And I go into that and I'm unfazed because I understand that. And there are some other groups where I've been around that I'm kind of at home there because I'm used to it from the heritage of my dad's side of the family. And but other people, it throws them off.
Oh yeah,
because it's and so as we go through life, we have those differences between us and the church.
Yeah,
and we're able to together be effective.
Yeah,
all things going in.
Yeah, so I mean that's kind of that's where Paul gives us as an example for us.
Yeah,
that we're to be servants. We are to try to beat people where they're at, as you said. I think that's the best way to look at it. You want to read 24 through the end of the chapter?
All right.
There's a lot of good stuff in here.
Yeah, starting at verse 24. Do you not know that those who run in a race all run, but one receives the prize? Run in such a way that you may obtain it. And everyone who competes for the prize is temperate in all things. Now they do it to obtain a perishable crown, but we for an imperishable crown. Therefore I run thus, not with uncertainty, thus I fight. Not as one who beats the air, but I discipline my body and bring it into subjection, lest when I have preached to others, I myself should become disqualified.
You ever heard of the Isthmian Games? Isthmian Games,
I think you might have mentioned them before to me. It's not fresh at the top of my head.
It's a thing that went on there in where it was within like a few miles of Corinth, and it was this like I think it happened every 2 years. Then there were these games that they would have all these different competitions, and there was an intense training period, like I think it was like 10 months long, and all of these different people would compete, and the winner, especially of there was a race that was run, and the winner would receive a like a wreath made out of pine boughs or something,
Okay.
and it was a great honor, and then their name would be written there at whatever temple they had there.
Right.
So that was a thing that happened there in Corinth, and I think that's what why Paul used this example,
Yeah.
because it was this big famous
And it would be something that they understood.
So, and it was only for Greek people could compete in this thing. You had to be Greek,
Yeah.
and
It's just like Christ, in speaking of sheep, and speaking of the shepherd, and so on. Those things would have been fresh in the minds of the people that were being spoken to.
yeah,
And to us, some of us maybe have more experience with farming or whatever, animal husbandry, than others. But then that was a very
it would make
pertinent
sense.
thing, and this the same.
Yeah, and it's the same way. So he addresses this idea. He says, "Hey, everybody who runs in a race, but only one person gets a prize."
Right.
It's
not like that anymore.
No, it still really is.
But it really is. Especially when you're, to use the analogy as it is here, we have to run in that way. That we're seeking after that prize.
Right. So he says, run in such a way that you may obtain it.
Yeah.
And you can't. That brings to my mind. About Jesus in his life, and he lived a perfect life, and he endured the cross.
Mm-hmm.
He ran that race in order to finish the will of his Father,
and he didn't have to prove anything.
No,
he didn't. He really didn't have to do that.
Yeah,
and but yet he did, because he was seeking after the will.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's and when you think about it, think about what happens, and I mentioned kind of tongue in cheek, that it's not that way anymore. What happens in society when everybody is rewarded, regardless of the way that they run?
Well, obviously there is no competition, right?
Right.
We're not actually running a race then.
People stop working hard.
Yeah.
And that's the point here. As Christians, we need to make sure that we are running to obtain.
Yeah.
So that we don't lose that drive and that desire to do well.
Right. Verse 25, he says, everyone who competes for the prize is temperate in all things.
So explain that to me, because I have my... Are we talking about...
Are we talking about running a race or being a Christian?
Right.
That's what I want to know.
So to be temperate in all things, is that speaking of taking care to prepare, to be?
To me, temperate means this idea of not overindulging in anything.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, that's what yours says. Temperate. Let's consult the English Standard Version.
All right.
Because that's the other version I have on my phone here.
That's kind of what I was thinking of, is that, as you're preparing for a race, you don't gorge yourself on heavy foods or whatever. You take care to make sure that you're able.
Yeah. So let me see here. What verse is that?
That is 25.
He says, every athlete exercises self-control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable.
Yeah.
So you know what's funny is that idea of a wreath.
Yeah,
That is what they won. So I
right.
think the ESV is probably a better translation than the New King James. But so yeah, so that's what it means. It means
Yeah,
that you don't want to overindulge in anything.
yeah. Yeah, you keep yourself able to run the race.
Yeah.
And so what does that look like for a Christian? Does that mean that we got to go hit the trails to
No.
thin down, or
I think if for me and you, it might not be a bad
might not be
idea.
a bad idea?
But I think what happens, there's a risk. You know, we can make we can make things our gods when
Yeah.
we overindulge in things.
Hmm.
You know, when we're not temperate in the things that we do, we can let something dictate our actions,
Sure.
and we got to be careful about that.
We can be brought under the power
Yeah.
of things, to use a scriptural term. And the other, when we think about that, um, we as Christians, we need to be prepared in such a way that we can share the truth of the gospel. We need to prepare that we might be able to put up with the difficulties. As you run a race, assuming it's not just a flat track, you're going to come to difficult sections, you're going to come to hills and so on. And so when we are presented with something that is a temptation, we need to be able to be strong enough to get through that. And the word is how we do that. And so we need to prepare ourselves in that way, spiritually, mentally, spiritually, so that we can obtain.
Yep. Next verse. He says, "Now we do it to obtain a. Now they do it to obtain a perishable crown, but we for an imperishable crown." So I think that's a probably, and that's kind of this similar. The ESV said every athlete exercises self-control and all things. He says they do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable.
Mm-hmm.
And the Bible talks about this idea of a crown.
Right.
And what do you think what's the idea of that crown?
That it's showing that you've won, that you've completed.
There's a reward.
Right.
That's the idea. And there's a lot of scriptures. I wrote down a whole bunch of them that reiterate that idea of obtaining a crown.
Right.
I don't think we need to go through them, but 1 Peter 5:4 would be one of them. So, but there's a bunch of them that talk about that idea.
Mm-hmm.
Paul says, "Thus I fight not as one who beats the air."
Yeah.
What the heck does he mean by that?
Well, it brings to mind, somebody who's just kind of, I don't know if you'd call it shadow boxing or something, where you just kind of, beating the air, and you're not really doing anything. You're
putting out a lot of effort.
You're going through the motions.
Yeah.
Yeah,
you are. You're going through the motions.
Yeah.
But Paul's hitting people.
Right. There you go.
Right. I think that's kind of what he's getting at.
Right.
Verse 27, he says, "But I discipline my body and bring it into subjection, lest when I have preached to others, I myself should become disqualified." The old King James says, I buffet my body.
Right.
So, that doesn't mean they ate Paul.
Right. Right. It's not a buffet.
It's not a buffet. Right.
Right.
So,
Yeah. And that's what we have to do. We have to force ourselves to do things that we may not necessarily want to do at times. That's just, we learn that in the world just as a part of growing up, in a physical sense. But, spiritually, when we're faced with the situation of, how do we structure our day, how many things can we find to do that take up our time and take it away from what we should be doing.
Right.
And studying and and being a good example to those around us. Sometimes, just today, my daughter, as she was doing her schoolwork, one of her assignments was to read the Declaration of Independence. And she came into the kitchen and said, "But I don't want to do that." And I'm like, yeah, but
we don't care.
Right. Basically. And, it's a good read anyway. But
Yeah.
anyway, sometimes we're faced with that where I know I need to do this, but we're faced with all these other things that can drag us away, and we have to fight against them.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I guess we'll move on to chapter 10.
All right.
Let's see here. We got 10 minutes. How far can we get in 10
we
minutes?
can say a lot.
How about let's go to verse 13.
Okay.
Is it my turn?
I think so. Mm-hmm.
Moreover, brethren, I do not want you to be unaware that all our fathers were under the cloud, all passed through the sea, all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank of the spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. But with most of them God was not well pleased, for their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. Now these became our examples to the intent that we should not lust after evil things as they also lusted, and do not become adulterers as some of them, as it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play, nor let us commit sexual immorality, as some of them did, and in one day 23,000 fell, nor let us tempt Christ, as some of them also tempted and were destroyed by serpents, nor complain, as some of them also complained and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now all these things happened to them as examples, and they are written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. Therefore let him who thinks he stands take heed, lest he fall. No temptation has overtaken you except which is common to man, but God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with the temptation will also make the way of escape, that you may be able to bear it. Boy, there's a lot of stuff there.
Right.
The first thing he starts off in the first 5 verses, he talks about, he goes all the way back to Exodus. So he talks about the cloud. He talks about them. They were baptized in the sea. It's Exodus chapter 14.
Mm-hmm.
And if you went over there and read that, that's where they're leaving Egypt, and the Pharaoh's chasing them, and Moses parts the Red Sea, and the Israelites go through on dry ground, and Pharaoh goes in and he's drowned.
Mm-hmm.
And in a way, figuratively, they were baptized through the Red Sea. The nation was.
Right. Yeah. And they all ate the same spiritual food in verse 3, and all drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. But with most of them God was not well pleased, for their bodies were scattered in the wilderness.
I mean, the spiritual food and drink, you can't help but think about the manna.
Mm-hmm.
Well, he says that they drink of the spiritual rock, and you got that vision of Moses striking the rock.
Right.
In Exodus chapter 17. Or he was supposed to speak to the rock in Numbers chapter 20, but he didn't.
Right.
Right. He struck the rock, and when he was supposed to speak of it, he sinned when he did that. But the Bible here says, the New Testament, Paul writes that rock was Christ.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and you think of all the things, all of the spiritual lessons that should have been learned as they were going through those trials. I had somewhat recently watched an archaeologist that had gone over to that area, and he thinks he might have found the place where the Israelites crossed the Red Sea. And as they were approaching the Red Sea, the place that they went, if indeed this is the place, it's a narrow canyon leading to the Red Sea with walls on both sides, and so there's no place for them to go. And so Pharaoh's coming down on them. He's thinking, I've got them. They're trapped. The people are thinking, he's got us. We're trapped. And then the sea opens up, and through each of those trials, through each of those, this isn't going to work, we're dead situations, and then the Lord brings them through that. By the end of the whole thing, they should have all been faithful.
Yeah, absolutely,
faithful.
Absolutely.
But again, that's even today that happens with the Lord's people.
Yep, they were scattered in the wilderness.
Yeah.
Right. So Paul says, now these things became our examples, right? And there is this idea that the Old Testament, even for us today, it's there as an example to us. I thought
Yeah.
Paul actually said that a couple of times in here. Yeah, he does in verse 11. He says, "Now all these things happen to them as examples," right?
Yeah.
So
Written for our admonition.
yeah, there's lots of places where it kind of talks about that idea.
Yeah. And what is it? What kind of feeling does the word admonish bring to your?
It means like encourage and rebuke.
Yeah. It may not be the most comfortable situation.
Yeah.
It's to admonish someone. It could be to spur them on a little bit, but it also has that connotation of, well, maybe you're slipping a little bit, and you need to step it up.
Yeah.
And that those are hard things for us to hear, but it needs to be done.
He says, "Do not become idolaters, as some of them were." Right. So you think about Moses when he went up on the mountain to get the 10 Commandments, and Aaron's down there, making a golden calf, and the people are worshiping it.
Right.
He says that is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. And that's when the Israelites went out and they intermarried with the daughters of Moab, right? And that's why he says, nor let us commit sexual immorality as some of them did. And in one day, 23,000 fell. That's Numbers chapter 25, tells that story. All these Old Testament examples, he says, nor let us tempt Christ, as some of them also tempted. It's funny that he says that the people, the Israelites, tempted Christ. Right? They just didn't realize that that's who they were tempting.
Right.
And he says, and were destroyed by serpents. So you remember that?
Off the top of my head, you refresh.
That's in Numbers chapter 21.
Numbers?
Yeah, Numbers chapter 21. Starting in verse 4.
They journeyed from Mount Hor by the way of the Red Sea to go around the land of Edom, and the soul of the people became very discouraged on the way. And the people spoke against God and against Moses. Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? For there is no food and no water, and our soul loathes this worthless bread. So the Lord sent fiery serpents among the people, and they bit the people, and many of the people of Israel died. Therefore the people came to Moses and said, we have sinned, for we have spoken against the Lord and against you. Pray to the Lord that he take away the serpents from us. So Moses prayed for the people. Then the Lord said to Moses, make a fiery serpent and set it on a pole, and it shall be that everyone who is bitten, when he looks at it, shall live.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
So what Moses made that bronze serpent. What did the people call that? Did you write that down?
I have it. Nehushtan.
Nehushtan.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I remembered it before I found where I wrote it. Yeah. And that's, again, we see this, as you well point out, we see this kind of a cycle of, going from following the Lord to not, and then they get into trouble, and then, pray for us that we, that you can take this away from us. It's an over and over again thing, and not to beat up on them because it still happens today. We do the same thing to the Lord all too often as on the whole, his people.
Verse 10 he says, nor complain as some of them also complained, and they were destroyed by the destroyer. So that's talking about Korah's rebellion. So we won't go in there, but that's what that's referring to. So he says, now all of these happened to them as examples, and they were written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. So, these things were written for us,
mm-hmm.
And what it shows us is the God of the Old Testament is the God of the New Testament, right? So he
Yeah.
deserves respect and he demands respect.
Yeah, yeah. That's that's one of the things to understand. My lesson this last Sunday started out with remembering that God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. That He has not changed. He really hasn't changed what He's asked from His people. It's just been obedience.
Yeah.
The whole way along.
Verse 12, he says, "Therefore let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall."
Mm-hmm.
We got to beware of self-confidence, right?
Right.
Think
Right.
about that. Remember when the tax collector was praying in the temple and he was beating himself and saying, "Lord, have mercy upon me, a sinner."
Right.
I think that's kind of. I think about that's somebody who's got the right attitude,
Right.
versus the other guy who was saying, "Man, I'm glad I'm not like this guy."
Right.
You know.
Yeah, and boy, that can be when you stop and think about it, that can be a microcosm of what we see sometimes amongst religious people today, and it surely shouldn't be that way in the Lord's church. But
Luke chapter 18, that's where that's at.
and as we one of the things, the next verse there,
Yeah.
No temptation has overtaken you except such as common to man. But God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with the temptation will also make a way of escape that you may be able to bear it. That's a very misused scripture in the religious world. And as we finished reading, I got to circling again in here, and I circled the you.
Yeah.
In verse 13 there, because who's the you? Who's he talking to? No temptation has overtaken you.
He's talking to me.
Well, and he's talking to Christians.
Yeah.
He's talking to those that are in Christ.
Yep.
And so this verse can't be applied universally across all of mankind.
No.
So if you're not in Christ, this is not something that you should expect.
Right.
And it also doesn't mean that God's just going to remove you out of every little situation that is a temptation.
No, but it does put the responsibility back on us.
Right.
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 So when we get into some temptation, there's a way to get out of it. Is what I'm saying. It's like there's a way of escape.
Right. And how? What would that way of escape be? How would we?
In one sense, you could just run away from it.
Mm-hmm.
Second says maybe you got caught up in it and you can repent and turn away from it.
Right.
I think those are the two methods, maybe.
And when you look at how do you find out about those things, it's the scriptures.
Yeah.
If we prepare ourselves with the scriptures, then we're gonna know that we have that way of escape. That 1 John 1:9, we're gonna have that second law of pardon.
All right, John, we better stop there.
Is that enough? Okay.
That's enough.
Well, thanks for joining in, everybody. We'll see you next time.